Hello everyone, and welcome to the launch of my very own podcast called All Things Beethoven. I am your host, Christina, and a little background about me is that I'm currently a third-year student studying at the University of Toronto. Just a little disclaimer before I begin, by no means am I an expert on Beethoven. I'm just currently taking a course on Beethoven and rather just becoming a budding enthusiast on Beethoven. Today's episode, titled The Influenced and the Influencer Beethoven Edition, will be about who and what had an influence or impact on Beethoven, and subsequently who and what Beethoven has influenced in the modern era, or modern day. A big name who has been influenced by Beethoven that you probably have heard of is the Beatles. I'll mostly be speaking based on information that I've learned in class and on some research that I did outside of class and apply it to the topic of today's podcast. I also think it's interesting to explore Beethoven's impact on popular music and popular or modern culture in recent years, which is why I decided to elaborate on this topic for the first episode of this Beethoven podcast series. Beethoven is an infamous name in his day and in today's day as well. I chose the topic of influence as today's podcast topic because personally I was curious to see what and or who influenced him and what and or who influenced his compositions. I was also curious into the influences that Beethoven has had for future generations, and so I did some research into these two questions and decided to present them to you today through my podcast. I'll be using some facts and information I found in articles and websites, as well as from the lecture notes I got from class. Additionally, I will also be adding my opinion and commentary on some of the facts that I have found. Looking back into Beethoven's background, though there does not seem to be any composition background in his family, he did have a musical background with his grandfather being a singer and a keyboard writer. According to this website, Britannica, that I was looking at, I quote, Beethoven was subject to the influence of popular music and of folk music. Heavy Rhineland dance rhythms can be found in many of his mature compositions, but he could assimilate other local idioms as well, end quote. To add in my 2 cents, I believe the fact that Beethoven was influenced by his surroundings essentially is a very reasonable assumption to make, since surroundings in general tend to influence people. Even in today's day, one example I can think of is Ariana Grande and Mariah Carey. It's been a long debated topic about them that Ariana would at least mimic the style of Mariah Carey in her early music before she really found her own style. Even a less specific example, if you listen to pop music nowadays, there are a lot of rhythms or even beats that are sampled from music from, let's say, the 80s. For example, Christina Aguilera's Feel This Moment was sampled from a-ha's Take On Me. If we want to take a listen here, this is Feel This Moment. And then if we take a listen to Take On Me, you can hear the similarity between the two. So this just goes to say that artists are evidently influenced by their musical surroundings, / the music that they grew up with. I'll elaborate more on early influences that I discovered over the course of this class, as well as through some blogs and articles online, but that's just a very quick introduction to the influences on Beethoven on his early pieces. Surroundings and geography weren't the only factors that had an influence on Beethoven and on his composition career. It is well known that Beethoven had a number of patrons during his lifetime. One specifically, his name was, apologies if I butcher his name, Prince Franz Joseph von Lobkowitz. Lobkowitz was known to be a very generous patron, as he would pay his workers and Beethoven very well, and he also loved music. Now, why did I include him in someone who has influenced Beethoven? Probably due to the fact that many pieces were dedicated to Prince Franz Joseph von Lobkowitz. Namely, they include Opus 18, which was the string quartet number 6 in B-flat major, and symphonies 3, 5, and 6. Fun fact about Opus 18, Lobkowitz actually spent an enormous amount of money for that piece, something like half his yearly salary. Although Prince Lobkowitz may not have an influence on Beethoven's composition style or even the message of these pieces, I can only infer that he definitely had an important impact on Beethoven himself. Otherwise, I can't imagine Beethoven dedicating not 1, not 2, but 4 compositions to Prince Lobkowitz. Most likely he had an influence in advancing, I would say, Beethoven's composition career, just based on the fact that he seemed to be paying Beethoven a lot. Another important patron of Beethoven's was his first patron, Prince Karl von Lichnowsky. Prince Lichnowsky had a significant impact on Beethoven as well due to the fact that Opus 1, number 3, which was the piano trios in C minor, was dedicated to him. Beethoven also dedicated Pathetic, which is piano sonata number 8 in C minor, Opus 13. Why was Prince Lichnowsky impactful? He gave Beethoven a place to live from the years 1792 to 1795, and also a salary from 1800 to 1806. He also arranged a concert tour for Beethoven as well. Even though the relationship did not end up well, it's still important to note that Lichnowsky was an impactful person in Beethoven's life. I would say he had the same kind of influence on Beethoven's, composition career as Lobkowitz did. Something that I thought was interesting to learn in class was that for the Opus 1 piano trios, Haydn, which is another very well-known composer, was critical of number 3. I think this could add to influence on Beethoven, because criticism and being challenged in general helps people improve. I would say this could definitely be seen as having an influence on Beethoven's growth as a composer as a whole. Furthermore, love interests are something important to consider as an influence in Beethoven's compositions as well. Just like how in modern music, love is a recurring theme on songs that are constantly being played on today's radios, it's hard to discount this major factor in Beethoven's composition as well. One of Beethoven's very famous pieces comes to mind under the topic of women and love, Moonlight Sonata, also called Piano Sonata number 14 in C sharp minor, Opus 27 number 2. Here is a short recording of it for those of you who don't know what it sounds like. From my class, we learned that this song was dedicated to Julie Guicciardi, who was one of Beethoven's piano students that Beethoven had fallen in love with. While in the lecture, I noticed that the melody is described as a funeral march, which gets me thinking that maybe this piece depicts a rather somber theme rather than more what you typically think of when you think of love. However, love, I think, can be somber sometimes too, and as I always like to think, music is up for interpretation, and two people can get different feelings from the same piece. Speaking on the topic of love interest, Beethoven's piece Für Elise, also called Bagatelle number 25 in A minor, was dedicated to Therese Malfatti as a gift. Beethoven wanted to marry Therese, but the feeling was not mutual, unfortunately. Another factor that influenced Beethoven's composition was his condition. Beethoven was starting to lose his hearing and entered a really dark period in his lifetime. During this time, Beethoven went to Heiligenstadt. Sorry if I butchered that. It is the north of Vienna, in hopes of somehow curing his hearing loss. When he realized that there was no such cure, this became a major stressor in his life that brought him to his middle period of composition, which brings out a new style of composition from Beethoven, often described as more of a heroic style. In the most recent class, the main topic was about connecting politics and Beethoven. This book that was introduced in the class, I think it was called Beethoven and Freedom. This book gives an idea on Beethoven's political beliefs. It describes him as an individual who believed in freedom and liberal ideas, and I quote, "He believed in the power of music to enlighten society and bring it to a higher level morality," end quote. From this, I can only imagine that Beethoven strived to influence society with his music. Further on in the lecture, we learned about the influence that politics also had on Beethoven's compositions. From what was discussed during the lecture, it could be said that it's actually not correct to say that Beethoven was influenced by politics itself. Rather, he was influenced by themes that came up with politics, such as possibly celebration of defeat, as this idea was mentioned in class. Moving on to Archduke Rudolph. So Archduke Rudolph is an important name to mention too. He was a composition student of Beethoven's. Archduke Rudolph was an influence on Beethoven evidently, since Beethoven dedicated so many pieces to him. I think Beethoven ended up dedicating 11 pieces to him, some of which included a violin sonata in G major, which is opus 96, 2 piano sonatas, opus 106 and 111, and many, many more. In my own thinking, I believe Beethoven possibly dedicated so many pieces to Archduke Rudolf due to the fact that he was an amazing student and probably showed a lot of promise, and so Beethoven took a higher interest in him. So I've talked a lot about what or really who specifically had an impact on Beethoven and his growth as a composer, but I think it's important to circle back and touch on the point of what factors had an influence on Beethoven's composition style per se, and the actual content of his pieces. I did mention at the beginning from the website that I read, the content of Beethoven's compositions was influenced by popular music around him. I came across another website recently that elaborated on Beethoven's influences on the early period of his compositional life. For those of you who don't know, there are 3 major periods that Beethoven's work can be grouped into. They are the early, middle, and late periods. Circling back to the early period, Beethoven was said to be heavily influenced by 2 other major composers. Their names are Haydn and Mozart. In regard to Beethoven's concertos, Mozart was a very big influence on Beethoven in his compositional style because, I quote from the website Spin Ditty, Beethoven borrowed a lot of structural ideas from Mozart's later concertos, end quote. It's said that Beethoven takes in Mozart and Haydn's musical expressions and style and sort of develops his own from that initial influence. Moving on to the middle period of Beethoven's composition periods, it's said that Beethoven was influenced heavily by Baroque music, so by composers more like Bach. This fact also found on the website Spin Ditty. These facts about Beethoven drawing so much influence and inspiration from composers who came before him, such as Mozart, Haydn, Bach, is important to note because it ties into how great musicians in this day and age, in the 21st century and 20th century, do still draw influence from major artists of the past, one of which is Beethoven. So it seems like it's a cycle. Musical greatness draws influence from each other throughout different generations. With the mention of the cycle of influence, or rather chain of influence, it's the perfect segue to start talking about Beethoven as the influencer. Many non-composition related factors, as well as lots of factors that directly influenced specific composition pieces style-wise, made Beethoven into the composer he was. I've talked briefly about some of the influences in Beethoven's life, and I feel it's appropriate to move into the flip side of today's podcast topic. Beethoven as an influencer. During the lectures in class, I learned a lot about Beethoven's pieces and the impact his music had on people during his time. But I want to delve a little deeper into Beethoven's impacts and influences, specifically around the time periods of the 21st century and late 20th century. I want to start off with taking a look at Beethoven's influence on pop culture in the current age as a whole before delving into the specific influence he had on specific artists. My reference for this section is this book called Ludwig van Beethoven, The Heard and the Unhearing, a medical musical historical journey through time. More specifically, chapter 12, titled Ode for Elise in the Moonlight, Pop Meets Beethoven. And this chapter is written by Michael Custodes. I'm not going to repeat any facts that I read in this chapter, rather I'm just going to voice out what I think of this chapter after reading it and how it adds on to this podcast. One thing I found very interesting was that in the chapter it said that modern day musicians, in a way, reuse key musical themes that have existed throughout Beethoven's time period, whether they're aware of it or not. I think that because Beethoven's had such a big impact on music as a whole, his influence is just now embedded in music generally, and whether musicians realize it or not, they're being influenced by Beethoven. Another point that I got from what I understood from this chapter is exactly the point that I make above, where the influence of Beethoven in modern day culture is so embedded that sometimes we miss it. That can be taken in the literal sense where Ode to Joy was used as the European hymn, and where Walt Disney had a film named Fantasia, which includes Symphony No. 6's first movement in the movie. These Beethoven pieces were enveloped into, I guess, a more typical setting, and people who maybe don't listen to classical music as much would not realize that what they're listening to is Beethoven. The point above can also be taken in a less literal sense, and I want to come back to this point in a bit. I want to digress a little bit from Beethoven's influence and talk a little about Beethoven's appearances in modern media forms. These examples are taken from CBC's article titled Beethoven's 10 Most Influential Moments in Pop Culture. One example is Schroeder from Charlie Brown and his obsession with Beethoven. Another major one is the movie Beethoven, the one about the dog Beethoven. The reason I bring up Beethoven's appearances on other media forms is because this furthers the point that Beethoven had an important influence, so important that he is constantly being mentioned in movies and such. Beethoven not only appeared in other media forms, but his pieces can actually be found in actual pieces today. Beethoven's compositions have left a lasting impression. In fact, his influence extends beyond just his era, as recent musicians have actually sampled his songs within them and taken his composition as influence in creating their own pieces. Some notable examples also taken from the CBC article Beethoven's 10 Most Influential Moments in Pop Culture include the Beatles song called Because. Because, or at least the instrumental of Because, was influenced by Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. The instrumental to Because is actually Moonlight Sonata, but played backwards. You can hear the similarities here. So this is Moonlight Sonata. And then if you compare that to Because, you can hear the similarities there. Another example also taken from the same website is Nas's song called I Can. Nas sampled Beethoven's Für Elise, and you can hear the similarities here. So this is Für Elise. And then this is Nas's song I Can. These are just a few examples of how Beethoven's compositions' influence extends to current artists and their instrumentals in their own music. Beethoven had influences on specific artists and pop culture, but he also had a grand influence on modern/recent music as a whole itself. In this article I discovered, written on the website called Calgary Philharmonic and written by Aaron Burkholder, it talks about how Beethoven essentially played a major role in transforming music into more than being just about form and musical structure. Beethoven sought to, and I quote, capture all the tragedy and comedy of the human experience. Structure and refinement gave way to emotion and the inner world of the artist. End quote. Beethoven sought to abandon traditional form and wrote all of his pieces all according to what he wanted to express through his compositions. He wanted to express his feelings through his compositions, and perhaps this can be considered a great influence on modern music. Even though most of modern music does contain lyrics to add on the expression of emotion, we hardly think of music as just structure or form nowadays. We think of music as an art, as an expression of feelings. So perhaps Beethoven had an influence on how we think of and perceive music nowadays. Although I'm not a composer myself, Beethoven's music has had an influence on my life as well. I've played piano for many years, and I personally really enjoy playing Beethoven's compositions in my free time as a form of enjoyment. Without Beethoven, I may not get to enjoy this hobby of mine, especially considering how much he had influenced the music following his time. Today's topic was very interesting for me to explore. In reading so many different articles, websites, and as well as looking through lecture slides, there was a lot that I realized about Beethoven and noticed how much influence Beethoven received in his own lifetime. Then also learning about the major influence he had on music in general and with specific artists. Knowing that Beethoven can influence anyone, whether it be big names in popular culture or a random U of T student like me. Beethoven's music is powerful and should be further explored. Stay tuned for more episodes to come. Thank you for listening today.